Starting, and we are live. So instead of a bug quiz tonight, I wanted to do something a little bit different than anything that we've ever done before on Ask an Entomologist. We've answered a lot of questions on Ask an Entomologist, and we've answered thousands of questions over the 2-3 years this site has been up. And that's sort of gotten me thinking about what it means to tell stories, especially in science. And I've come to think of this as a mutual, I've come to think of the whole idea between asking somebody a question and answering that question as a mutual storytelling exercise. So in our email and in our Facebook inbox and everywhere where we get questions, typically what happens is somebody tells us a story about something they saw. And then they ask us for more information, and in essence, they're asking us to finish the story. And throughout the years that we've been doing this, that sort of realization has gotten me to think about my own career as a scientist. And I've started to realize that scientists, the core of what we do is storytelling. And we don't tell stories like normal people. We tell stories using numbers and graphs and charts and observations and data. And even the most beautiful, complete, comprehensive data set is completely meaningless unless we have some sort of narrative with which we can tie that data together. We need to use that data to tell a story so we can understand it. So to me, storytelling is one of those things that sort of extends beyond science communication and beyond what we do at Ask an Entomologist. It extends into science itself. And I've always wanted to talk to a professional storyteller about how to tell stories, because this is something that I was never really taught and something that I really don't understand very well. And when we have questions about this sort of stuff as scientists, what we do is we reach out to somebody in another field to ask them those sorts of questions. About 6 months ago, I started following a YouTube channel called Lessons from the Screenplay, which is run by a guy by the name of Michael Tucker, who's a filmmaker, and he's our guest tonight. And the thing that I really liked about this channel was the fact that it was really well done. He focuses on good movies, and he talks about the exact storytelling elements that make those movies good. And the channel is very accessible, and the advice he gives extends far beyond the art of filmmaking. And I've actually taken a lot of advice from his videos and used it to improve my own writing. So a few weeks ago, I reached out to Michael and asked him if he would be willing to come and talk with us about his profession and how storytelling and filmmaking relates to storytelling and science. And he graciously accepted, and we're really lucky to have him here with us tonight.
I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So for our audience, why don't you tell us a little bit about filmmaking and why you decided to start Lessons from the Screenplay?
Sure. Well, I've always wanted to be a filmmaker since I was like a toddler, and I spent a lot of time in high school and then in college studying film and filmmaking, and it was always from the director's point of view and how stories are told visually and through the pacing and the editing and all this stuff. And eventually I kind of realized that I had skipped over a lot of the basics and hadn't focused as much on the screenwriting aspect of filmmaking. And I think that's something that a lot of film students do, is that they get excited about the visuals and the cameras and the stuff that's more tangible and obvious, and skip over the basics of storytelling. And so I decided to pause my pursuit of directing for a little bit and really focus on screenwriting and improving my writing and studying the basics and really getting a good handle on the foundations of what makes a film and what makes a story. Yeah. And in the process of doing that, I was reading a bunch of screenplays, and then I started taking notes on all the screenplays. And then I was like, well, maybe I can write a blog for each screenplay I write as a way of internalizing the information for myself, but also sharing it with people. And as I was writing those blog posts, I realized maybe these could be videos. And so I did some research on other kinds of video essays that were out there, and just had this idea that I think this is something that people could really get something from. It was something that I hadn't seen done. There's a lot of analyzing, again, directing and cinematography and all these sort of technical aspects of filmmaking, but not a whole lot of information about the basics of what makes a story really good. And so that was sort of the inspiration for the channel originally, is wanting to teach myself even more about the basics of storytelling, and in the process share that with people and other film students that might be like me and be focused on things that will be useful later, but skipping over the basic core of storytelling.
Yeah. So we started asking entomologists because we wanted to sort of know what people were thinking about, insects. And as I said, it's sort of gone into this. We now write a lot of stories about insects to tell people how they work. And this is a site that's become very, very popular. You know, we get 10,000 views on the blog every month, and we have 10,000 likes on Facebook, and we've gotten this really big following because we tell a lot of stories that are sort of interesting to a broad audience. And I was sort of wondering if you could tell us, you know, as you put it in your video for Ex Machina, what makes a story work from a sort of mechanistic storytelling point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the basic core of storytelling, especially in filmmaking narratives, is desire and obstacle. So it's usually all about a character who wants something and there's something standing in their way. It's sort of the most basic dramatic foundation is what is the character's objective and what is the obstacle preventing them from that. And so I think that's sort of the main core that everything else builds out of. It's interesting because there's sort of counterintuitively, I think people assume that to reach a broad audience, characters need to be generic and likable and sort of hit these stereotypical ideas of, you know, what we think a good guy is. But I think actually it's exactly the opposite, that the more specific a character is and the more an audience can learn about the details, the unique things about the character, it makes them feel more real. And so they identify with the character in a deeper way. And that's one of the things I loved about Ex Machina, is that it's, you know, it's a story about an artificial intelligence that's, you know, it's completely not human, but it's, her situation is so specific and the characters around her are specific. And so it's, you know, sort of a simple story, but the pieces, the players in that story are very specific and really unique. And I think that intrigues people and gets them invested in a story.
Yeah. And in that movie, the characters themselves are also fairly complex. I mean, you can't really describe any of the characters in a single sentence. So, go on.
One of my screenwriting professors from college used to say, simple stories, complex characters is just a motto to keep in mind. And that I think a lot of films do work that way, where the story isn't complicated. You don't need all these moving pieces to be intriguing. You need simple conflict and then interesting people put into that situation. And I think that gets people into it.
Yeah. And how does I was talking with a friend, and we were sort of talking about how different people's voices can create, Nancy and I don't write the same way because we're not the same person. We have completely different personalities and different backgrounds, and because of that, we tell different stories, and that's because the stories of our lives are very different. So as a sort of jumping off of this question, how does the author's experiences factor into the stories that they tell? Like what role does the author play in talking to the audience when telling a story?
I think the author is I think that's where the most interesting specifics come from, is from, like you said, everybody has a unique life. They have a unique perspective that they've lived. And I think that's why people tend to like certain filmmakers. Like I'm a big David Fincher fan who did, Fight Club and Seven and all these awesome movies. And part of the reason I like his films is because of the way he tells his story. And like you can get a sense of the things that he cares about and how I feel like he respects the audience and treats them like intelligent people. And so I feel like the storyteller is a big part of it. I think that's what people connect with in a lot of ways. It's like people can connect to the individual story, but I think they also often identify with the way a story is told and like that and want more of that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good answer. So the next question that I've had, and this has sort of been a big struggle with me throughout my science writing career, but I write a lot about insects, and insects are about as far removed from humanity as you can get. They're they don't look human, they don't act human, they have completely different motives than anything we could ever possibly understand. And one of the things that really strikes me is that a lot of film writers seem to be able to easily create characters that are like literally, or like in your Nightcrawler video, are figuratively inhuman.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a challenge that I struggle with, but they seem to be easily met. So what are they thinking about when creating these sorts of characters and making them compelling?
Yeah, well, I think, like you mentioned, the Nightcrawler video, I think is a good example of, in that film, Jake Gyllenhaal plays a sociopath who is not likable and does despicable things, but the film still works and you still want to know what's going to happen, and you're not quite rooting for him, but you're still like invested in what's going on. And that one of the reasons I chose that film is because I was fascinated by like, how is that possible? And the answer and the trend that I kept seeing was that it's all about empathy, and specifically understanding why a character does what they do, and like crafting a situation where someone who's has never lived this life can look at that situation and see, oh, well, they want this thing, but this thing's standing in their way, and I understand that the only way for them to get their desire is by doing this. And so I think I think it's largely about crafting a situation where people can understand the goal and then understand the limitations that are being pushed on the character. And then I think they can understand and go along with the actions that they take, even if they don't agree with them. And I think, in animated films, I think it's easier because they do a lot of anthropomorphication, just, make the critters look really cute. And so then it's like you can identify with them easily. And I think they give them, human desires and stuff. But I think that I would think that people can empathize with basic survival needs, whether it's ways that we are familiar with, or how insects might have different priorities, but like everybody needs to survive and pass on their DNA and all that stuff. So
you sort of need to find the things that the shared struggles that insects and people have, or in some cases the struggle, the fact that it's different, might be what draws people in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what sounds interesting to me, is that like, we're all basically doing the same thing, trying to survive, but like insects might have a completely different way of doing it. And I think I think people like finding out new things and twists on, things that are familiar. So I think that could enhance it in some ways.
Yeah. So this talk of perspective is, you know, and again, I want to bring up your video Ex Machina because it's one of my favorites. But in that video, you talk about how the screenwriter uses perspective and how he uses that to sort of control the flow of information in the story. And in my work as a researcher and you know, the science communication stuff I do, a lot of what I do is I talk about information. Sometimes it's pure information, you know, this protein kills X percentage of insects and stuff like that. But I was wondering how scientists could use the flow of information to improve their storytelling, because that seems like a really useful tool, and also a tool that's really hard to understand in that context.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think when I was working on that video, I was sort of trying to zoom out as far as possible, just like what is storytelling on its most basic level. And I think storytelling is just conveying information, right? It's choosing as a storyteller, what information do I tell the audience when to get the desired effect that I want. And I think, you know, in that video, I talk about reveals and like twists in stories as something that's compelling, but, you know, depending on the kind of story that you're telling, there might not be twists. But even just like in my videos, I feel like I use the same basic principles of how you are revealing the information to engage the viewer, because, you know, my videos have a lot of information in them and I want them to be accessible and entertaining enough, because I think, you know, if you get bored, you might tune out. And there's a really good video by another YouTube channel called Every Frame a Painting, which inspired a lot of my videos. And he talks about how he crafts stories for his video essays. And he actually has a clip from the South Park writers, and they are talking about just this very basic principle of when you're revealing information and telling a story, if there's too much and then, that's when people kind of tune out. So if you're just saying, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, there's no dynamics to it. And so what they recommend is every major beat in whatever story you're trying to tell should have a therefore or a but in front of it. So rather than this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, you should say, this thing happened, therefore this thing needed to happen, but then this thing happened, so therefore this other thing happened. And so it's a very kind of simple change, but if you can kind of understand what it's doing, I think that's what can draw people in. And so when I make my videos, I sort of start off each one presenting kind of like a problem that needs to be answered, or like this movie does this thing really well, how do they do it? And then I sort of break it down into each section. So the first section says, it does this thing really well by doing this, this, and this, but this doesn't account for these other things. So let's look at how it does this other thing. And then it does talk about that, but it also does this. And so it's sort of trying to craft like dynamics into the flow of information, I think, is what can keep people engaged more than just, you know, reading a list off of all the information, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it reminds me of oh, people are going to make fun of me for forgetting this guy's name, but there's a really famous writer who talks about the shape of stories. And if you graph a character's sort of happiness, how happy they are versus time, stories take on specific shapes.
Mm-hmm.
And in the story, if it's about a character, sometimes it's not, but it's easier to explain with a character. The way that I'm sort of interpreting your statement is that there should be sort of motion in that area, and you should be able to relate that motion to specific events.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that...
I think that's, yeah, pretty good way of looking at it. Of like if you had like some you know, a bunch of information you wanted to convey, if you can break it down into, it's sort of like a basic essay structure that like you learn in high school even, is just like, what is your thesis? And then what is your conclusion that you want to get to? And then find ways of creating little sections that build up to that. And so, and then try to give a dynamic of, it's almost like a causality thing of, this is this way because of this, but then this also has an effect on this other thing. And this other thing works this way, but that causes this to go this other way.
So you want to draw a clear line between cause and effect, and where you draw that line in the story that you're telling is where you draw those lines in the story that you're telling. The things that explain the cause and the effects are what you can sort of use to measure that flow of information, and either how fast you're presenting it, or how slow you're presenting it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it.
Because a lot of the posts that are sort of a lot of the posts that people I have a lot of posts that people dig up even 5-10 years later and share, and a lot of those posts I've noticed have they sort of have differences in how many of those sort of connecting pieces there are. So some of them present them, they start out with sort of a long explanation of, as you said, the problem, and then sort of continue the story, and then at different points they sort of call back, and at the end of the post, the ones that people seem to share, at the end they seem to sort of reference those and then sort of put all those pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good way to do it, or?
Yeah, I think having a summary of the points at the end, and even maybe in the beginning, can help people prepare for the information. Like, that's something that I do in my videos, to sort of introduce the general topic that I want to talk about, and then list off, these are the 3 aspects that I'm going to be looking at, and then go into each of those during the video, and then tie it all together in the end. And I think that even just on a subconscious level lets people prepare for the amount of information that they're going to receive, and probably helps them retain that information. Like, I think that's in my before I launched the channel, my first video that I made, that was a comment that I got from someone, is like, I wasn't sure how long this video was or how many things we were going to be talking about. And so that made me less engaged, because there was always something in the back of my mind, like wondering how long is this video? What are we going to talk about, etc. And I think having a certain amount of expectation of the duration or the breadth of topics that are going to be talked about can help. Because even like a movie, you go to see a movie, you sit down and it's going to be about 2 hours. And so I think that helps frame the information and the story, and lets people get more comfortable with it too.
So at the very beginning, sort of set the scope of the story, and then as you move on, make it known that this is sort of why these things happen, and then sort of create the world that you want to see, and then use the sort of thing that you're trying to explain to create, sort of do this whole world creating thing. We talk about the scope of the story, and then, for example, the environment the insects exist in, whether it's political, economic, or like literally the environment. And then you sort of talk about the science behind the issue that you're discussing, and then use the bits of information you want to discuss to refer viewers back to the environment that these things are creating, the roles of the environment that these things are creating.
Yeah, and I think it's like, I think the challenge with storytelling is that are no like hard and fast rules, and there is
Yeah.
no formula. But I think, yeah, generally being able to some point at the beginning before diving into specifics, convey an idea of this is the problem that we're going to try to be solving. This is where we're going to end up by the end, and maybe hinting at the ways that that problem is going to be solved helps give context to the rest of it.
Yeah. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is a fairly important topic for me, but back in high school, I read the Seven Basic Plots by Christopher Booker, and in it, he describes basically all the sorts of stories we tell. And I try to make use of as many different types of narratives as we can. And I was just sort of wondering, what sorts of stories do you think people tell, and what sorts of stories should people tell if they want to sort of describe our shared reality?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think because my focus is on film, I feel like a lot of film screenplays are a pretty classic like hero's journey storyline, and so I'm not super familiar with the different kinds of plots or the different classifications of that.
Yeah.
But I think they probably all share a core of that, you know, the basics of objective and obstacle, and so I think being able to, you know, like I said, like read that and have those different like archetypes in mind, I think people can relate to any of them. I think that's the reason why there are so many similar patterns and structures as far as films goes, that like there's something about this kind of story that resonates with people. And so I think any of them can be used to convey, you know, our shared reality, as long as there's something or someone in there that the audience can identify with and empathize with.
Yeah. So the story doesn't really necessarily matter so long as the characters that you're writing are things that people can identify with.
Yeah, I think people need to have in a narrative story a person or something to empathize with and to carry them through the events of the story with. And I think it's interesting because in different, you know, like when writing video essays, there's no character, but I think making sure there's that same kind of flow of the obstacle, the objective and the obstacle, or I sort of think about it as like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Here's how that problem gets solved. What problem does that lead to? And here's how we solve that problem. And so I think it's those basic ideas that draw people in. And then I think the specifics of whatever you're talking about maybe lend themselves to different kinds of archetypes, like the overcoming the monster or the rags to riches or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think that's probably the role that the storyteller plays too, is like what, you know, when you are looking at the information you want to convey and trying to come up with a story that you feel works for it, I think whatever speaks to you will speak to other people, and that like that's where the uniqueness comes from as well.
Yeah. So another one of the things that's really struck me about filmmakers who tell stories is that a lot of filmmakers use different languages in their stories. And scientists, one of the things that we really struggle with is we speak a completely different language than most people. You know, if I use the phrase 80s Aegypti, only a handful of people might know that I'm talking about the yellow fever mosquito. And a lot of times in filmmaking, what a good filmmaker can do is they can have a character that speaks a completely different language than the audience speaks, and they can make they can make the audience sort of understand what that character is saying, sometimes without even saying a word.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always felt that understanding how this works could really improve my own storytelling by either being able to minimize the need for these really highly scientific words, or maybe even eliminate them altogether. So how do filmmakers sort of craft these characters where you can understand what they're saying when either they're not saying anything, or they're speaking a different language?
Yeah, and well, I think what's nice and helpful in filmmaking is that it's a visual medium and it's an oral medium, and so there are like if you look at something like WALL-E, where the main character only says the word WALL-E, and his partner in the film only says Eva, or Ava. I feel like that the basics of storytelling are still there, and they're conveyed through visuals and facial expressions and sound cues and all these different other tools that filmmakers have at their disposal. But I think what each of those things is trying to get at is, again, the basic elements of, because we see WALL-E look at this object in a certain way, we can tell this is what he wants. But then when you cut to a wide shot, we see the obstacles that are preventing him from getting it. And so I think it's using the tools of whatever medium you're working in to try to convey those basics in a way that is maybe more accessible to people. Or like I think of like Inception, and that's a film where there's a lot of rules and words that are, some of them are made up, and there's a lot of information flying around. And I think some people leave the movie remembering all that, some people don't. But I think because that language is tied to something familiar and tied to this character wants this, or this is what they're trying to do, and in order to do that, they have to, rules, jargon. I think even if they maybe don't walk away remembering the specifics of it, they understand the purpose of it and the role that it played in the bigger scheme of things. So I think if there's some way to tie it into something familiar, then I think people don't have to get hung up on the specific jargon or words, etc. And they'll understand the purpose of it or the meaning behind it, even if they don't recognize the words.
Yeah, because in papers, when I read science papers, a lot of times jargon is used as a sort of cornerstone for the discussion, because we only have a certain amount of space, and big words minimize the space that we use. And to sort of rephrase your answer to make sure I understood it, just sort of, if you have to use jargon, push it to the background and don't make it something that's central to the story. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are probably different approaches to it too, as I'm thinking about it. Like, I think you could potentially create interest around the jargon if there's like, you sort of explored the history of the word and like why this word was, constructed the way it was and what the pieces are. I think like there are a lot of YouTube channels that talk about science, and they're all sort of you know, based on this idea that people like learning trivia or this really interesting thing that you didn't know. And I think in certain situations, rather than like hiding from the jargon, you could like lean into it. Like if it's going to be a cornerstone, like find a way to give the background or the context of where this word came from and why it means what it means and why it's so important. Or yeah, so I think there are probably different approaches to it. I think either way, yeah, I think you can either try to tie it to something familiar and not, you know, tell it in a way where people don't have to be familiar with that jargon, like you were saying, like push it to the background, or try leaning into it and making the word itself part of the story if it happens to connect well, or, you know, the history of the word leans well into the rest of the topic, something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good answer. So those are all the I think those are all the questions that I had for you. I know that you're a busy guy, and I'm really glad that you took the time to talk with us. So, I mean, is there anything that you want to know about what it is entomologists do, or anything of that nature?
I mean, I am someone I find science fascinating, and entomology is something that I never think about. So I am kind of curious, like, what is your day-to-day job look like?
So, what I do for a profession, as I said, I work in agriculture, and there are these proteins that people put in crops so that they don't have to spray pesticides. And my day-to-day job is to test those proteins against a whole wide range of insects to make sure that they have highly specific host ranges, or highly specific ranges of things that they target, so that we don't end up putting something in crops that could hurt anything but that pest.
Mm-hmm.
And because I work for industry, I'm under something called a non-disclosure agreement, and I'm not sure exactly what I can say, but I test quite a few individual insects every week in insect species, and it's sort of an interesting field because we also deal a lot with economics. So we talk a lot about corn prices at work, and stuff like that. But it's not something I ever thought I'd get into. But hey, here I am.
Yeah.
So
that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I appreciate that you're trying to like bring the storytelling in and like making that connection, because I do feel like so much of life and all these different like science and art and all these things are interconnected. And I think, you know, learning, I think people like to learn, and so
yeah,
it's about bugs,
and
people, it's all information for how to live.
one of the things that I've sort of noticed about a lot of my colleagues is a lot of the people who are really good scientists also have some sort of artistic ability. So my friend Amy Jeffries and Nancy as well, they're amazing artists. They can sit down and draw and do all that. Our new writer, Jody Mars, she does cosplay, and she does it amazingly. She creates these outfits and makeup, and she can become a completely different person in a matter of hours, and that's an ability that I don't really have. And as for me, I'm apparently a good writer, according to a lot of people. So yeah, a lot of science and art are very, very highly linked, and I think that a lot of it is storytelling, but I think it's also sort of this shared desire to explore the world. And I sort of view science and art as opposite sides of the coin. So we're trying to explore the world empirically, and artists sort of explore the world emotionally. And I honestly don't think that you can have one without the other. You need to sort of love what you're learning about and love what you're doing in order to explore it. You have to have that curiosity there. And I think that's where that sort of art and science link comes from.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree, and I think what I love about both is that they're generous things. Like when they're done well, it's about sharing with other people, and I feel like that, you know, it connects people in valuable ways.
Yeah. All right. Well, as I said, you're busy, and these are the questions that I wanted to ask, and you gave us some really good answers. And I hope that not only can we improve our storytelling at Ask an Entomologist, but I hope that a lot of our colleagues who see this video will go out there and start telling stories, and start thinking about story structure and stuff like that. So again, thank you for coming on. Once again, I really admire Lessons from the Screenplay, and the work that you do on that channel is really, really great. And I hope you keep it up, and I'm going to keep following you for years to come.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. All right. Take care, Michael.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.